Ever feel like life's just one wave after another and you're barely keeping your head above water?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, that feeling of needing a lifeline. Well, that's what we're diving into today, finding genuine hope.
Love it.
And I don't mean just wishing things were easier. We're talking about an anchor for the soul. And that's where John Kratz's book, Hope, Living Confidently in God, comes in. It's like a 31-day toolkit, super practical for building that unshakable kind of hope.
I like that, a toolkit.
Right, because we need practical help sometimes. But before we get too far, what exactly is biblical hope? How is it different from just, putting on a brave face and hoping for the best?
That's such a good question because I think so many of us get tripped up by that. Biblical hope isn't about pretending the hard stuff isn't there, or that everything's sunshine and roses. It's about shifting our focus. It's like adjusting your lens from a really narrow view to seeing that whole panorama.
Okay, I like that. So it's less about the problem and more about...
More about what, exactly? God's character and his promises, which never change.
They don't.
Yeah.
Which is so reassuring, especially when everything around us feels shaky.
Absolutely.
But how does that actually work, though? When you're in the middle of a struggle and it feels like everything is that problem.
Yeah, that's the tough part. Kratz uses this great visual, though. Imagine holding a penny right up to your eye. It's huge, blocks out everything else, right?
Well, you can see.
Exactly. Our problems can feel the same way. But when you move that penny back, you see the bigger picture. That penny, the problem, it's still there, but it's not all consuming anymore.
It's about perspective, choosing to view it through a different lens. And that lens is...
the lens of God's presence and his power, which, and this is key, never changes, never runs out.
Right. It's constant. I love how he puts it. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Like an anchor for the soul.
Oh, I love that image. You can almost feel that sense of relief as the anchor digs in, securing the ship even when the storms are raging.
Yes. And it's not just that Jesus is constant. It's that he gets it. He genuinely understands what we're going through.
Absolutely. In his humanity, Jesus truly understands our struggles because he walked this earth, he faced temptation, felt the weight of human suffering just like we do.
It's easy to put Jesus in this box of divine perfection and forget that he experienced life as a human being.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about how he interacted with people who were hurting.
Oh, absolutely. Kratz talks about the story of the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And, just stop and imagine dealing with something for that long, spending everything you have only to get worse.
Talk about feeling hopeless and probably so alone, like nobody understood what she was going through.
Exactly. And yet when she reaches out to even touch Jesus's robe, he stops. He could have kept going, but he senses her touch. He sees her, recognizes her desperation, her faith, even in the middle of a crowd.
It's like, even in his own busyness, he was so present with people.
Present.
There's something so hopeful in knowing that he sees our pain.
He does. And that's the thing about biblical hope. It's rooted in a God who sees us, who is intimately acquainted with our pain and doesn't offer some empty platitudes, but tangible compassion.
Yes, which is infinitely more valuable.
Yeah.
And it's not just limited to his time on earth either. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Right.
Because he endured suffering, he's able to help those who are being tempted. Hebrews says that.
It's so important because, sometimes when we mess up over and over, it's easy to feel like God's given up on us, that there's no hope for change.
Oh, yeah. But that's not what we see in Jesus. And what I find really encouraging about Kratz's book is that he doesn't shy away from the hard stuff. He dives into those specific areas where we often struggle to find hope. Finances, relationships, that nagging feeling of never being good enough.
Right. The things we wrestle with every day.
Exactly. So what are some of the practical ways he encourages hope in these areas?
And he doesn't just offer a quick fix, or some empty platitudes. He consistently brings us back to the source of true hope.
Which is?
God's character.
Okay, so it's not about conjuring up some magical sense of hope from within ourselves.
No.
It's about connecting our hope to something unshakable.
Yes, his nature and his promises.
What are some of those aspects of God's character?
Well, one that really stood out to me was God's sovereignty.
Ooh, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Especially when life feels chaotic, out of control, it can be tough to wrap our minds around the idea that God is still in control.
It really can. And that's where trusting in him comes in, because when we talk about God's sovereignty, what we're really saying is that he is the ultimate authority. Nothing happens outside of his control, which, it can be a tough pill to swallow when life feels messy,
For sure. So how are we supposed to connect with that? Trust in it? How do we even begin to understand that?
Well, Kratz illustrates this really beautifully through the story of Joseph.
Oh, yeah.
Remember how Joseph's brothers, they sell him into slavery.
They did?
He's falsely accused, imprisoned for years.
Yeah, talk about a roller coaster of a life.
Seriously, right. And yet, I mean, this is what's amazing. Through it all, even when it felt like he had every reason to just give up on hope, God was doing something incredible.
He was orchestrating.
He was orchestrating,
Yeah.
and not just in Joseph's life.
Right, it impacted way more.
His whole family, and then countless others. And it's this powerful reminder that God can use even the most difficult, even seemingly tragic events for good.
And just as God was faithful to Joseph, he's faithful to us.
Yes.
And speaking of God's faithfulness, Kratz also talks about his resurrection power as another key to fostering hope.
Yeah.
It's not just that God can bring life out of seemingly dead situations, but that he's done it.
He has. And he doesn't just mention this in passing. He gets real about his own struggle.
Oh, wow.
With despair. Sharing from 2 Corinthians where he says, utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself.
It's so comforting to know that even someone like Paul, who we often view as this spiritual giant,
Right.
that he experienced those moments of hitting rock bottom.
Of hitting rock bottom.
And that even when he felt like giving up, God showed up.
Yes.
In power.
In power. And it's this powerful reminder, it's not just a nice story about Paul, that we don't have to have it all together.
Thank goodness, because I don't.
Right. We're human.
Yeah.
We're going to have those moments of doubt and fear and what have you.
Absolutely. And that's where the good news comes in,
Yes.
right? That we serve a God who brings life out of seemingly dead situations.
Mm-hmm.
That even in our weakest moments, when our hope feels non-existent, God's power is made perfect.
It is. It's this beautiful paradox, isn't it?
Yeah.
And speaking of amazing grace, he tells a story about King Manasseh that just, I don't know, it floored me.
Oh, yes. Now, that's a story that highlights just how boundless God's grace truly is.
Oh.
For those who don't know, this guy was bad news. I mean, we're talking about one of the most wicked kings in Judah's history.
Like, this guy went all in on rebelling against God, rebuilt pagan altars, sacrificed his own sons in fire, even turned God's temple into a hub for idol worship.
You'd think there'd be no coming back from that.
Right. And yet God offered him forgiveness and restoration.
Wow.
If there's hope for Manasseh, there's hope for anyone.
There is.
It's like that verse where sin increased, grace abounded all the more.
It's so true.
It speaks volumes.
It does. It speaks volumes about the heart of God.
It does.
That he doesn't wait for us to clean up our act
No.
before extending mercy.
Before extending mercy, he doesn't.
He meets us in our mess, offering a fresh start no matter how far we've strayed.
He does, and that is just incredible.
It's such a good reminder that God's grace is bigger
Yes.
than our failures.
Than our failures.
And it makes me think about how Kratz also addresses how hope plays out in our everyday struggles. He specifically talks about finances, relationships, and that persistent sin that we all deal with. And he always connects those struggles back to the character of God.
Always.
So it's not about mustering up some sort of internal hope or strength, but it's about looking outside of ourselves.
Outside of ourselves to the one who has it all.
Yes, exactly. So when we think about those areas, finances being a big one, what are some of the practical ways that he encourages hope in that area specifically?
Well, one of the things he talks about is God's faithfulness as being that source of comfort and guidance. In those times when we're dealing with financial difficulties, he actually points us back to Matthew 6.3334, where Jesus tells us to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, trusting that he will provide for our needs.
Which is so easy to forget.
Oh,
Right?
it is.
When we're stressed about bills, it's like, that should be the first thing we think about.
Right.
But often it's the last thing we think about.
It is.
We get so caught up in the how, instead of focusing on the who.
Exactly.
And the who being God.
Yes.
The one who created it all, who breathed life into us.
Who's got this?
Yes, exactly. So it's about surrendering our anxieties to God, but at the same time taking practical steps to manage our money well.
Absolutely. It's that balance of faith and action,
Right.
knowing that we're not alone in this.
Yeah. What about relationships? Because that's another area where hope can feel really elusive, especially in those relationships where, there's been deep hurt.
Deep hurt. Yeah. And, what I appreciated about what he had to say there was this emphasis on forgiveness and kindness.
Okay.
And really reflecting on God's example in Christ.
Which is huge because especially in those relationships where we've been deeply hurt, It's really hard to forgive.
It is. It is. And, he brought up this really interesting example from Acts. Paul and Barnabas.
Oh, yeah, they had a disagreement.
They did. They had this major conflict that led to them parting ways, and it just goes to show even spiritual giants
Experience that.
It's
so easy to put those leaders on a pedestal and forget that they were human.
They were human.
But they had conflict.
They did.
They had hurt.
They had hurt, and yet there's still that hope for reconciliation.
There is, and that's what's so amazing. Even when things feel fractured beyond repair.
Beyond repair, yeah. It reminds us that God can work in and through our human flaws and shortcomings.
He can.
And bring about healing and restoration in ways that we could never imagine.
It's beautiful. And then there's that other area, the sin that so easily entangles. What do we do with that? When it comes to hope, that can be such a difficult area because we feel like we're constantly battling the same things.
We are. And, that's where his reminder about the armor of God from Ephesians 6 is so powerful.
Okay.
Because he emphasizes that our hope isn't found in our own strength.
Okay, so tell me more about that. When we talk about the armor of God, for those who aren't familiar,
yes.
What do we mean?
So when we talk about the armor of God, he's talking about combating those negative thought patterns.
Okay.
And really replacing them with the truth of God's word and his promises.
Okay.
So when we put on that belt of truth, we're reminding ourselves of God's unwavering faithfulness.
Even when we're not.
And then that helmet of salvation, it's shielding our minds from those lies of the enemy.
Oh, yeah.
That tell us we're beyond redemption, which we're not.
We're never beyond redemption. And it's not a one-time thing.
No.
It's something we have to choose.
Every day.
Over and over and over again.
Every day. It really is about putting on that full armor.
Yeah. It's a daily choice.
It is.
To put on that armor. But sometimes, even with our armor on, it can feel like we're losing the battle. Those moments where despair starts to creep in.
It does.
We wonder if God's really there.
It can feel like he's abandoned us altogether.
Yeah.
And, I think that's where the Psalms can be so comforting, especially Psalm 42. It doesn't sugarcoat the struggle at all.
No, it doesn't.
The writer is crying out to God from this place of deep despair.
Yeah.
Questioning why he feels so far from God's presence. He even compares himself to a deer panting for water, like that desperate thirst, that longing for God's presence, but feeling utterly parched and alone.
Alone. It's so raw, so honest.
It is.
And I think it's so important that we have that.
We need that permission.
That permission to say it's okay to not be okay.
To not have it all together, to not have the answers.
Yes.
But here's the important part. Even in the midst of that agonizing cry, he redirects his focus.
He does.
He commands his soul. He says, hope in God.
Yeah.
Reminding himself that even when God feels distant, his love and his faithfulness never fail.
It's like we have to remind ourselves sometimes. Choose hope, even when we don't feel it.
Even when we don't feel it, it's a choice.
It is. It's a choice to say, God, I don't see it, but I'm trusting you.
I trust your character.
Trust your promises.
Even when my circumstances haven't caught up to them yet.
Yes. It's about hoping in someone, not just for something.
That's it. Our hope is anchored in the person of God.
And that brings us to something else that Kratz talks about, this idea of waiting on the Lord.
Oh, the waiting game. The hard part.
Waiting. Ugh. It's the worst, right?
Oh, it is. We live in a world of instant gratification, so the idea of waiting patiently when we're hurting or when we're in a difficult situation, it can feel almost impossible.
It does, but how do we do that?
Yeah.
How do we cultivate that kind of patient hope, especially when it feels like, God is taking his sweet time?
Well, Kratz points to several psalms that offer guidance for those seasons of waiting.
Okay.
One that really resonated with me was Psalm 62.5. For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence, for my hope is from him.
It's about quieting those anxious thoughts in our heads, isn't it?
It is.
And just fixing our eyes on him.
Yes.
He is the source of our hope. It's not about suppressing our emotions or pretending that we're not struggling, but it's creating that space. To listen. To hear from him. So it's about making that choice to trust his character, his promises, even when we don't see the immediate results. And Kratz talks about how waiting like that actually strengthens our hope, doesn't he?
He does. He actually compares it to a watchman who's eagerly anticipating the first rays of dawn. That sense of anticipation?
Yes.
Of knowing that the light is coming?
It's coming.
Even though it's still dark?
Yeah.
That's what fuels our hope.
I love that. Because it's true. It's that anticipation. And there's something so beautiful, I think, in knowing that God uses those seasons of waiting
He does.
to refine us,
To grow our faith.
to deepen our dependence on him.
Yes.
And I love how Kratz emphasizes this too, that as we wait, it's not just about sitting around twiddling our thumbs. It's an active hope. It compels us to live differently.
It does, to make choices that reflect that trust in him, to act on that hope.
So it's not about escaping our circumstances or passively waiting for a miracle,
No.
but about actively engaging with life, trusting God with the outcome.
Trusting him to show up in his way, in his timing. And sometimes that's the hardest part.
It really is, to surrender that control.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the nature of biblical hope, what would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember today?
That's a great question. I think it's this. True biblical hope. It's not just this fleeting feeling, or a wishful thought. It's a choice. It's a daily decision to fix our eyes on God, on the unchanging character of God, and trust that his promises are true, even when our circumstances haven't caught up yet.
It's about choosing to live out of that hope, allowing it to shape our actions, fuel our perseverance, keep us moving forward, even when the path ahead seems unclear.
Yes, that's it. Exactly. And here's a beautiful paradox. The more we exercise that hope, the stronger it becomes. It's when we choose to trust, even when everything in us wants to give up, that's when we experience the power of hope to carry us through.
It's like this wellspring of inner strength that we can tap into, and it comes from knowing that no matter what we face, God is with us, he's for us, and his grace, it's always enough.
And that is a hope worth clinging to.